I know this is corny as hell, but when Nero leapt out of the van here and Devil Trigger came on for the first time, I legit broke into tears. I just couldn't believe it was here, man. I still can't. Think about it, this isn't just the first proper Devil May Cry in 11 years, it's also the first good action game in the style since, Wonderful 101. The first one on this level of hardware, no less. It's not just games that have changed a lot in the time between DMC4 and now, it's also gaming as a whole, the discourse. This honestly feels like the first time that getting S ranks or playing on higher difficulties are a part of the zeitgeist now. So many people are finally discovering why these games are so special. I no longer feel like a weirdo screaming into the void about jump cancels. Getting to use all these interesting tools in one chaotic situation after the other, with everything on the screen being a one-to-one translation of my skill and my creativity, that's like peak video games to me. It doesn't get any better. And the Devil May Cry series has always been the purest expression of this idea. DMC doesn't just give you a context-sensitive parry button or whatever. Instead, you need to make it so that your attack collides with the enemy's attack, clashing blades. In practice, this means I could ram into an enemy about to bulldozer me with a motorcycle, or I could cast a whirlwind of ice around myself and wait for them to attack me. The possibilities here aren't just endless, they're all viable and interesting. Think about it, this is just one aspect of the combat system and you're already weighing up the pros and cons of a billion different moves for the situation you're in. DMC's mechanics are so malleable and chain into each other so logically that it leads to an infinite amount of possible scenarios. This is the direction Hideaki Itsuno took the series in with DMC3, and what's so remarkable about 5 is how it takes lessons from so many different places and realizes its potential to a degree I didn't think possible. Superficially, this is kind of a safe game, barring some obvious excursions, but there's so much going on under the hood that I don't even know where to start. I'm speculating a bit here, but I always got the sense that Itsuno was never super comfortable having to fill the shoes of the people who created DMC. I mean, he was this veteran fighting game director at Capcom suddenly thrust into the series because 2 sucked and they trusted him to right the ship, so it's only natural that he'd eventually want to introduce his own character and be less creatively constrained. If DMC4 was our first introduction to Nero, DMC5 is where he fully transitions into the de facto protagonist of the series, and this is conveyed both through the mechanics and the narrative. I mean, they're not shy about it, he's front and center in the marketing and even on the friggin' title screen. But the setup is just so clever. You start out with your powers being taken away from you, looking like a chump even against basic enemies in the intro because you just can't do anything. As the game progresses though, you gain more and more fighting tools, and you'll have to adapt to both them and the increasingly chaotic situations you're thrown in. You work with what you have. I already made videos explaining why that's such a compelling idea for a combat system, but what I didn't expect is how well it works thematically. Stripped from his powers, Nero is farther from Dante's legend status than he's ever been. The perfect solution for every problem is never just a tap of the D-pad away for him. Sometimes he'll even have to give up one of his Devil Breakers to be able to fight back. Fast forward and you'll be going through arduous fights completely naked. I guess you could say his frustration is getting bigger. Bang, 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 pull my Devil Trigger, oh! Yeah, it's not subtle, but the fucking catharsis of actually seeing Nero pull his Devil Trigger once Daddy Virgil shows up after having listened to that song for the entire game is crazy. Overcoming Virgil carries so much symbolic meaning here. He is both this ghost that's haunted Nero for his entire life, but also someone he had to rely on in the past. It's appropriate then that the song Devil Trigger now turns into Silver Bullet. That's what Nero has become, laying everyone's nightmares to rest and piercing through the darkness.
Drop this.
I can't even begin to describe how genius it is that they saved Nero's Devil Trigger for the final boss. It's just so thematically appropriate and puts you, the player, on the same exact page as him. Having 2 extra buttons now that were completely unused before makes you feel just as overwhelmed as Nero is by his new powers, and yet the fight is still easier than Dante's version from before. Everything about the animations, the camera work, how the music is timed is perfectly executed. Then you get to let loose in the playable credits sequence, and it's where you feel everything slowly coming full circle. There's even brand new loading screen hints. I can't imagine a more direct way of telling players that this isn't over yet. Nero is still such a juicy character in DMC5. There's this natural ebb and flow to playing as him that I'll never get enough of. The way Exceed, Blue Rose, and Snatch work together is practically begging you to follow up every move with another. Every attack is so committed, and yet there's never any downtime. Stuff like the air taunt seems hella dumb, but it's actually so brilliant. It grants invincibility, it gives you mid-air momentum, you can exceed out of it, and it boosts your style. There are so many different reasons to take advantage of it. I also like Nero's new dive kick. It doesn't knock enemies away, meaning it's great for jump cancelling if you want to expend all your Exceed charges. Plus it acts as another gap closer in case Caliber misses. Wow, so smart. Speaking of jump cancels, this is probably the biggest overarching mechanical change in DMC5 for me. Enemies have much larger hitboxes, and you even have a little bit of a wind up before you actually gain height. This way you can time your attacks comfortably while staying level with the enemy. It's definitely not as easy as it was in the reboot. You're still actively fighting gravity, but it's lenient enough that you can pull it off with confidence. I personally really like this for 2 reasons. Number 1 is that it's just way more accessible to a larger number of people now. Jump cancelling has essentially been the cornerstone of the series since DMC3. I would honestly equate it to dodge offset in Bayonetta in that it's basically mandatory to do well on the highest difficulty. Staying on the ground for too long just isn't safe. Bayonetta actively pushes you toward using dodge offset, and it's not a mechanic that necessarily requires ridiculous precision or timing. You just need to wrap your head around how it works. I feel that jump cancelling in DMC5 has the same philosophy behind it now. Any player should be able to get out of harm's way with enemy step or implement it into basic combos and keep improving from there. The other thing I like is how the ease of jump cancelling now opens up possibilities you never had before, especially with Nero. You can use Snatch to make it to the top of the screen if your timing is good enough. You can JC split and then pull the enemy back in for another combo immediately. The triple jump and the air taunt combine to give you so much more flexibility in the air. I just talked about how all of Nero's moves gel together so naturally, and DMC5 blows open the doors here more than I could have ever expected. I'll go into this more later, but while I can definitely see why some people aren't happy with how a lot of the advanced mechanics are implemented or not implemented, it's very clear the developers made these changes with intent, and I think you gotta respect that. What you also gotta respect is the Devil Breaker system. I already made 2 whole videos about it, so I won't go over it again in too much detail, but the final game definitely delivered on my expectations. There's a crazy attention to detail here. Even just activating Tomboy will launch surrounding enemies. Going into the big spiral attack from there, oof, that feels good. Punchline is another feather in the cap of so dumb but so good. Launchers, crowd control, keeping guys suspended, remote detonation, big ass dragon punches. It's not only versatile, all these options complement each other. My DMC3 comparison is still accurate. It's worth planning ahead and equipping certain breakers for situations you know are coming on repeat playthroughs. And yet whatever setup you have, you never feel completely helpless. Fury is a great example of this. You do have to approach this enemy differently depending on what you have, but you can always deal with them no matter what. This is especially true once you get your Devil Trigger and Buster Arm back. Even with no breakers equipped, you can always DT to gain the upper hand or give yourself some downtime with a grab. Having a second Devil Bringer button seems kind of excessive at first, but mapping it to L1 is actually so nice for when you need to hold down a face button. They get some good mileage out of it in general. I love the DT double snatch, and damn, that Bringer Knuckle Knuckle. Most of Nero's moves have these drawn-out animations to give you a chance to power up Blue Rose or Time and Exceed charge, and if I now mash L1, the move will be further augmented. Even during Nero's many canned animations, your fingers get stuff to do now. It's brilliant. Using the Bringer Knuckle during a streak and then also hitting the EX Act timing at the end, you feel like a god. But then you combine all of those things with the Devil Breakers and boom, you don't want Overture to knock enemies away. Pulling out the Bringer Knuckle will draw them back in. Using it with Helter Skelter turned that weapon from one of the most useless to one of my favorites. It's a prime example for how beautifully all the different mechanics work together. Post-game Nero feels like such a complete character. Even the way you keep having to destroy your arms gives these fights a sense of urgency and chaos that I hadn't felt in the series since DMC3. The release you get from breaking out of a tight spot and having to adapt your playstyle from that point onward, it's just too good, man. But even though it works so well in a design sense, I do have to admit that I couldn't help but wonder what kinds of possibilities a more freeform breaker switching system might open up. The current risk-reward implementation makes for some of the most exhilarating fights in the entire series, and I wouldn't trade it for anything, but hot swapping between Punchline and Gerbera inevitably becomes an itch DMC5 is unable to scratch. I guess that's what mods are for. Or maybe you don't need mods, considering Dante is still here and still style switching. Yeah, I guess it's time to bust that skeleton out of my closet. Now, the overall approach to the system is actually subtly different from how it was done in DMC4. They do this funny thing where Dante keeps getting wrecked and has to go through a bunch of different swords, and then it culminates in the forging of the new legendary sword, Devil's Sword Dante. That's a bit narcissistic, don't you think? So you take it out for a spin, and oh my god, you can mash triangle to do aerial rave, whoa. You'll then also realize that this is the case for all of Dante's weapons now. Pressing triangle in the air will never send you back to the ground. This makes switching weapons mid-air combo much more comfortable, but by extension it also means that you're way less reliant on Swordmaster. It's finally possible to do air combos while staying on Trickster the entire time, so when I want to dodge and move back in, I only need to press circle like with every other character. Wow, go figure. But the genius part is that you still get a lot out of style switching here. Using Swordmaster with Dante equipped will conjure up these summoned swords, and they can be used for all sorts of rudeness, but you're also just gonna have to mash them out along with your normal air combos if you want to maximize your damage. But this obviously makes defense a lot harder. The risk-reward element of that shines beautifully in the Urizen and Cerberus fights. It's one of those little touches that lower the skill floor while also raising the skill ceiling, and it's great. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is kind of the pattern with Dante's tools across the board now. Every move is just that little bit more versatile than before, and those differences really add up. At first, I hated how Rainstorm goes like outward before Dante slowly moves his hands down. That makes it a lot harder to hit enemies below you if you're still used to how it worked in DMC 3 and 4. But then I started experimenting and realized how much better the damage was, and what a great combo extender it can be if you just pay attention to your height. Instead of having to do an inertia transfer to get it where you want it to go, you get direct control over the trajectory with the analog stick, and that makes it incredibly flexible. You can use it as a gap closer, you can use it to get away, you can use it to buy yourself extra airtime and JC out of it. It's one idea that solves many different problems. Miyamoto would be proud. Virgil probably makes the strongest case in the entire series in favor of Dante needing this ridiculous number of moves. When he's shooting his summoned swords at you, you can either dodge roll, or shatter them with Coyote, or block them with Royal Guard. And each of these responses requires a different level of skill to execute, while also granting a different level of reward. Having all these tools right at your fingertips at all times makes it so tempting to go for riskier shit, do the same thing but slightly cooler and better. And the game makes that such an enticing proposition by lowering the barrier to entry just enough that this stuff seems feasible. The fact Royal Guard uses DT instead of health now if you hold block, and that you can move at the same time, and that you always have something to spend the gauge on thanks to Royal Revenge, tiny changes that, when added up, have made it far easier for me to step out of my comfort zone. And I've even managed to carry a lot of that practice into DMC 3 and 4 now. Just think about that. That first video essay I put up on this channel all these months ago, it showed some clear growing pains for me as a creator, and judging from the response, it's obvious I didn't get my points across as well as I should have, but what I just talked about, that's the problem with DMC4. It takes DMC3's moves, gives you access to all of them at once, and calls it a day. Too many of these moves are so niche in their application, and they don't complement each other because they weren't made to complement each other. Unless you're using inertia, I guess? And then it asks you to trick up and shotgun hike some shitty ghost dude to death. Like, yeah, have fun, that's what we're gonna use style switching for. It misses the point of why DMC3's system was great. It imposed limitations on you, and those limitations forced you to adapt your chosen playstyle to your moment-to-moment needs. But DMC5 finds a different way, by changing Dante's moveset in ways that make sense and where all the tools do complement each other. By giving you a ground trick to make closing gaps easier. By having weapons with separate stances and hold properties so that you have access to a lot of moves even when you're in Gunslinger or Trickster. I still get overwhelmed, I still press the wrong buttons sometimes, but no longer do I feel like I need to claw just to do basic shit. I never had a problem with having to get good, man. I like a challenge. My problem was that nothing about Dante flowed logically or in a way that seemed like it had any real design put into it. But I do have to stress, even with how much better style switching is implemented here, I still don't think Dante's levels here match the immediacy and chaos of DMC3's encounters. DMC5's Bloody Palace is the same for every character, and trying to do it with Dante, you'll quickly realize how awkward it is to fight a lot of these enemies as him, compared to Nero, I mean. This is a feeling I never had going through the campaign. Dante's stages often have you go up against a handful of medium-sized enemies with a decent amount of health, because that's what works best with his toolkit. So in that sense, DMC5 does fix the biggest problem of its predecessor. Every mission feels like it was tailor-made for its respective character. And while the mechanics are malleable enough to where fighting Cerberus as Nero is actually super fun, I think tacking this many moves onto a character inevitably makes for less tight encounter design. There's still always going to be like a million more moves you just can't make work in any given fight, and the designers seem to agree with me on that, considering how much more lenient Dante's scoring system is compared to DMC4. It's the exact opposite of DMC3 in that regard, and that's why I'll always have a preference for that game as far as Dante goes. I also can't help but ask, now that even Dante uses back-forward inputs, do we really even need separate styles on the D-pad? Like, think about this. You could easily give Swordmaster, Trickster, and Royal Guard their own dedicated buttons, and map all the good Gunslinger moves to either back-forward square or 360 square. Do you really need backslide? Do you really want to fire E and I independently? Having that extra button was a much more logical proposition in DMC3 to me, where it's like, yeah, okay, I'm choosing to be a gunslinger now. I'm gonna use moves I would otherwise never touch. As much as I personally like this idea for a control layout, because that way you would never press the wrong button and never get mixed up, I'm definitely starting to appreciate something I didn't quite understand when I made that DMC4 video. Having an impractical filler move like backslide, that is gonna have value to some people in a series where the point is to go out of your way to look cool. I personally believe that minimizing the number of required button presses for an action is just a good design practice, but the physical demand of style switching will always have its own appeal, which is something I said even in that first video. Damn, woke. It's like I went, please Itsuno-san, may I have a weapon wheel? And he just goes, here's a regular full custom. The fewer weapons you have equipped, the faster you can switch between them. Pussy. You know what? I can't say anything against that. You win, man. Okay, actually, I'll say one thing about weapons. Having 8 to choose from is definitely better than 6, especially when 2 of those were Lucifer and Pandora, but I still feel like a lot of these moves and functions could have been consolidated more. Like Kalina Ann, first off, it's lame they picked that one from DMC3 and not based Spiral, but also I'm like literally never going to use this thing outside of the downward mid-air launch move, which, yeah, yeah, that one owns. Maybe you could have just, I don't know, made the shotgun work like this. I almost feel like that was a thing in this series at one point. Am I remembering it wrong? The exact same thing goes for Cavalier. Like, I'm happy for Itsuno that he's finally managed to make it happen and it feels real good, but the only move you actually see people using in combo videos is the Stinger kind of thing, exclusive to Cavalier's DLC Deluxe Edition variant. That's not the only advantage over the vanilla version though. The default super armor seems neato, but on DMD it just means you'll get massacred with no way to break out of it. Getting knocked out of a combo with Cavalier R is actually preferable on this difficulty, though that still doesn't make it exactly viable either. You know who gets massacred on any difficulty though? I avoided everything related to V before release, and can I just say what a treat it was to watch him team up with Griffin and Shadow? Seeing them use their attacks from DMC1 and how they're tied into Virgil's torments between the end of DMC3 and now, so cathartic. This game leans into every corner of the DMC universe. Okay, maybe not that one. Sometimes with blatant fan service, yeah, but more often than not in a way that's incredibly well-rounded and satisfying for a longtime fan such as myself. That's really what makes V such an interesting inclusion. He's the single strongest link we've had to DMC1 in any of the sequels, and yet at the same time, he's like the most anti-DMC character ever. According to Itsuno, the idea behind him was to separate the part that attacks from the part that has to be defended. In practice, this concept is realized in a pretty extreme way. Shadow and Griffin fill the screen with devastating effects, whereas V himself is presented as a frail man who can do very little on his own, both through the story and the mechanics. This ostensibly makes him the polar opposite of someone like Dante, but at least as far as presentation and polish go, V actually does manage to stand toe-to-toe with his colleagues. He delights in drawing out the death of his enemies in these vicious executions. He doesn't just stab people with his cane, he does a little twirl as he jumps away. You can practically feel his flamboyant energy emanating from the screen when he lands on the ground after using Royal Fork, fixing his hair as he slowly rises up. And you thought air guitars were cool? Check out V putting the V in air violin.
On me. Come back.
So don't get it twisted, V is a pretty stylish guy. Unfortunately, actually putting that on the screen can present a bit of a challenge, especially for Devil May Cry veterans. Earlier I described DMC as the purest action game there is, where movement and offense are completely intertwined and your every button press is reflected perfectly on the screen. And when I call V the most anti-DMC character ever, what I mean is that that's just inherently not the case with him. With Nero, getting the enemy to move also means moving my character, whereas here I have to stand in place while I wait for my pets to do the work for me. That alone creates a strange underlying disconnect, but what makes it worse is that every action will inevitably be subject to a bit of a delay with this kind of system. I have to wait for Shadow to move over to the enemy, and by that point they might already be attacking me, and then I'll have to dodge, and since dodging uses Shadow, I'll have to wait for a bit before he'll actually listen to me again. I've had people tell me to just dodge to call Shadow over, but clearly that doesn't work. Now imagine I launch a guy with Shadow and then I want Griffin to launch him even higher. Sometimes the flank attack will just miss. The game desperately needs a way to tell Shadow and Griffin to cancel whatever they're doing and move over to either V or the enemy with no delay. I wouldn't even mind spending some Devil Trigger to do this. As it stands, it takes insane coordination to get anything even mildly cool looking to happen. And that's the problem. Compared to the other two characters, V requires the highest amount of effort for the least amount of reward. And by reward, I don't necessarily mean good scores. It's mad just how far spamming will get you on the lower difficulties. Mashing it out with Shadow while you lay one charge attack on top of the next with Griffin is a guaranteed S rank. That's also why I recommend rebinding your controls and not relying on the lock-on too much so V can keep moving at full speed while the fireworks are going off. Strangely enough, V V's playstyle didn't really start clicking with me until I tried Hell and Hell difficulty. Since you die in a single hit here, trying to do an execution on the ground is signing your own death warrant. So that's when I started to actually give a shit about juggling enemies. Setting up a safe execution with a launcher feels amazing. Enemy Step still fulfills a valuable purpose with V in that it lets you get to safety after a teleport or as an alternate way to avoid damage. There are a lot of fun little nuances like how Royal Fork keeps enemies suspended or that summoning Nightmare will revive your fallen allies. But then, at the same time, you're subjected to so much buffoonery with Nightmare specifically. Why does he take so long to get up after being activated? Why does it take so long to get off of him during promotion? Why does the teleport only work like half the time? The fact getting hit during promotion on Hell and Hell will not just kill Nightmare, but also deplete your Devil Trigger completely is fucking maddening. And that's what it boils down to with V. Too often am I subjected to a lack of control or systems that don't feel fully thought out. Why can't I use quick play for some sick co-op attacks mid-combat? Was waiting for V to read William Blake to gain Devil Trigger really the best implementation for this idea? Could it not have been some kind of close-up taunt instead? Some risk-reward maybe? I love V as a character, and I think his playstyle has potential, so I hope they give him another chance to shine someday. Which, unless we get a special edition, might be kind of hard considering how DMC5 wraps itself up. The whole heartless nobody thing is really hilarious to me, and Virgil seemingly retaining V's memories and character development is a neat touch. I guess that's the justification for Trish being in this game. And Lady and Nero both have an asshole dad in common, I guess. Yeah, great job to the writing team. But I still feel like that's a waste of V's character. I honestly wouldn't have minded for him to just replace Virgil now going forward. I ran this idea by a friend, and she was like, yeah, but also if Virgil wasn't in this game, then I would have killed myself. And you know, that's a fair point. I'm just so not down with these retcons, man. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'd always assumed Dante and Virgil had a The Boss, MGS3 kind of thing going on, each of them taking away something different from the death of their mother. Dante honors her memory by embracing his humanity, whereas Virgil believes that humanity to be the reason for her death, and therefore tries to cast away that side of himself. But if these flashbacks are to be believed, then actually Virgil is just really mad mommy loved Dante more or something. Like, really? That doesn't feel true to the character at all, if you ask me. Also, how many innocent people did Virgil kill exactly? Because that makes the whole sibling rivalry and there are other ways of settling your differences thing seem really weird. Like, no, Nero, I'm pretty sure Virgil is the bad guy here. I'm sorry if I seem super anal about this stuff, but it all compounded in a way where DMC5's climax didn't quite hit me in the way I would have liked on my first playthrough. This game had a huge weight on its shoulders, considering it's both the return and the de facto finale of DMC, and that causes it to go in so many directions that sometimes it just doesn't quite stick the landing. Am I saying that I would prefer DMC 6 to be a tight Nero solo adventure in the style of DMC 1 or 3? Yeah, pretty much. It's strange then how the post-game gave me a bit of a delayed catharsis. Over 100 hours later, a lot of my smaller disappointments have faded away, and playing more DMC5 is basically all I think about. This is easily the best Dante Must Die mode since the original game, to the point where it feels weird to go back to the lower difficulties and just chew through enemies like butter. It's where everything truly clicks into place. Every fight is so chaotic and fast-paced, and yet it's also where experimentation and risk-taking really start to pay off. You reach what looks like the last quarter of a boss's health bar only for them to go into Devil Trigger. Once you make it to the other side alive, you'll notice your entire body feeling stiff and that you've been holding your breath for the last 5 minutes. What helps the replayability is the total lack of gimmicks and filler. I personally find DMC's on-rails platforming pretty inoffensive, but it doesn't add anything to the experience for me. Everything in DMC5 uses the core mechanics, and anything that's not pure fighting is totally optional. This setup means that on your 9th playthrough you can just go, and yet all the optional stuff is still really well hidden and fun. Some levels have branching paths, others have you dropping down. one. There are few attempts to disguise the blatant circular battle arenas, but they do mix things up in terms of stage layouts and geometry. I would have appreciated some visual variety in the game's midsection, and yeah, Mission 13 does feel like the level designers just kinda gave up, but the early levels especially have my favorite kind of atmosphere in the game. Exploring these beautiful deserted ruins with nothing but these foreboding, pulsating synths pushing you from one fight to the next. You just play and play and play without interruption. It's fantastic. The sound team deserve huge props in general. Dynamic music with EDM and dubstep influences is probably the best thing to come out of the reboot, and man, the effects, so crunchy. Covering the enemy design in detail is way beyond the scope of this video, but rest assured I can't think of a single foe here that isn't a joy to fight, which is definitely a first for an Itsuno DMC. This is also the first Itsuno DMC without a turbo mode. Yeah, it's the part of the video you've been waiting for. DMC is back, and while this should be a wholesome time for the entire globe, you know, era of peace, Reiwa baby, unrest has been brewing in the community. Apparently, the Capcom execs don't want to dedicate more resources to DMC5, which is pretty weird and disappointing, because I get the distinct sense that the developers had more plans. There aren't any promises I can hold them to. I don't want to be entitled, but the lack of turbo specifically bums me out hard. I also want to address the whole inertia/reversals thing now that we know the game won't receive any more updates. People have been going about this debate in entirely the wrong way from day one. First off, it's totally pointless to try to tell advanced players that the stuff they care about doesn't matter and that DMC5 is still a better game than 4 or something. You can't say these things like they're objective truths, because what ultimately draws you to a game, what makes it all click, it's very personal. It's not like you can just bring yourself to enjoy DMC5. If the mechanics don't elicit the same response as those older games for you, then yeah, that sucks. At the same time, hashtags and spamming the developers and posting condescending rants isn't the answer either. The developers have explained their intentions behind the changes, and while I agree that the exact wording leaves something to be desired, trying to sell DMC4's mechanics as just objectively better for everyone involved is kind of disingenuous. Things have calmed down a bit now that we have mods on PC, but this whole conflict is still a perfect encapsulation of why so much of the DMC community reacted so negatively to that first video I made. I'm interested in the design of the game, what the developers are trying to make me do, whereas a lot of DMC4 players fell in love with that system, the raw ability to interact with the game in these super malleable ways. This dichotomy has always been at the heart of the genre, and as Devil May Cry went on, the series would often sway one way or the other, and it's always done so to the dismay of either of those two sides of the fanbase. I never wanted to be dismissive of all the combo video virtuosos, but if I was, this video is where it all comes full circle, and I apologize. DMC5 is providing me an opportunity to really explain why I love these games, and now that you've made it to the end of the video, I hope you'll feel like I've seized that chance. When I'm in the thick of it, pulling two guys into the air with me and activating Devil Trigger, only for Nero to scream his lungs out as my heart is pumping to the rhythm of the music, that's what I come to Devil May Cry for. It's when lovable characters, insane amounts of polish, and expressive mechanics all come together to make true magic happen. That, to me, is Devil May Cry.
Let's hear what that sounds like!
Hey gang. I hope it was worth the wait. Not much to add, to be honest. I have a channel update for y'all tomorrow, hopefully tomorrow, with some pretty big announcements. So yeah, stay tuned for that. I don't know if it even needs saying. I mean, yeah, it's been so long. I know. If you've made it to the end, you're a true fan. And I really appreciate you. And I would appreciate it even more if you shared the video around, because, you know, I'm pretty proud of it, and I worked very hard on it. And it means a lot to me. Also, I guess, I've never really plugged my Ko-fi, whatever it's called, account. It's a link in the description. You can make $3 donations. one-time donations if you're so inclined. I would really appreciate that as well. It always puts a smile on my face when people go out of their way to do that. So yeah, again, check back in tomorrow, or whenever the channel update is released. And stay devilish